to the employers' meeting for the Shropshire County Pension Fund. My name's James Walton, and I'm the Head of Finance, Governance and Insurance at Shropshire Council, and therefore the Pension Scheme Administrator for Shropshire County Pension Fund. I'm just going to give a quick introduction. I'll just take you through the agenda for today. So I'm just going to give a quick 10-15 minute introduction on kind of the support act before we get on to the main items, where our actuary, which is Mercer and John Lucy and Mark Wilson from Mercer, are here today. They will be taking you through the 2016 valuation results. So this will give an indication of where we are in terms of our 3-year actuarial valuation. I'll talk about that in a little bit more in a moment. Then there'll be a break, there'll be an opportunity to get a coffee, and then 11:15, Debbie, our Pensions Administration Manager, Debbie Sharp, will be on to give you an update in relation to the statutory requirements for data within LGPS. Then back to John and Mark, who will give a little bit more of the talk about horizon scanning for LGPS into the future. And then by 12:15, the individual results for the employers will be available for you to look at and consider. We should be all done and dusted by around about 1:30 at the latest. So, actual valuation. So 3-year valuation was undertaken. Why do we do this? Well, one of the reasons that we have to is because it's legislated. So the Regulation 62 of the Pension Scheme Regulations states that we have to take a valuation of the pension fund every 3 years. So 31st of March 2016, latest valuation, and then we will then take another one every 3 years after that. We don't do it any more often than that, simply because there is a lot of work that's involved in producing this. By the same token, to extend that out over a longer period would mean that those individual cuts at a period of time would be too far apart to get an overall view. So three-year valuation is undertaken, and within that, the actuary produces a report, and then a rates and adjustment certificate is prepared. And as the administrating authority for LGPS, we, as Shropshire Council, undertakes the administration of the whole process. So, what is the process? Well, most of you will be aware of the way we work through this, but just to give a refresh, we bring in an independent actuary. We use Mercer and Shropshire. We've used them for many years. What we then do is we calculate the overall liabilities relating to the fund as at 31st of March 2016. So this looks at the benefits built up into the future for all of the members. It then looks at the assets that are held within the fund and compares the two. And the difference between the two identifies the level of funding that we have within the scheme. The reason, and one of the most important factors of undertaking the valuation, is it then looks to see what the employer's contributions should be going forward based on the active members and the benefits that they will be accruing into the future. And if there is a difference between the assets and liabilities and that funding level, then it will set out a plan for managing and dealing with that shortfall within the valuation. And so at the end of it, a report is produced identifying the key findings, and for the employers, this is really around what those employers' contributions would look like and what that overall funding level is. So to give an idea of the timeline that's involved with this, valuation, as I say, is at 31st of March 2016, so that's the point at which the member data is produced. So over the intervening period, taking us up to the 4th of July, all of the employer's data is collated, validated, and sent off to the actuary for them to consider. The actuary then works on that data and information, and as of today, we then have the interim results that are produced on the back of that valuation. So the point of the meeting today is that we can show the culmination of that work. It gives Mercer an opportunity to explain the process by which that valuation has been undertaken. It gives you, as employers within the scheme, an opportunity to understand the process behind that, but also ask any questions that you have on the back of it. And as I say, at the end of it, you'll then get the interim results provided. As the valuation represents a material change in the valuation of the fund, we produce and update the funding strategy statement. So that funding strategy statement is in draft at the moment, and this sets out the principles by which the fund will be managed, looking at the long-term approach in relation to managing the assets and liabilities of the fund. It's looking at how the liabilities within that fund are best met going forward, and it sets out the principles in relation to employers' contribution rates, but also the recovery period over which any deficit within the pension fund will be identified. So that funding strategy statement will be released. John will talk about it a little bit more when we get onto his bit. But that will be open to consultation to everybody in this room, all the employers, and we'll be running that for the next 4 weeks before we finalise that statement. The end of the timeline by 1st of April 2017. This is the date by which those amendments to employers' contributions and deficit repayments would be implemented in relation to the budgets of the employers for the next 3 years, so 17, 18, 18, 19 and 2019, 20. So, I'm not going to steal John's thunder in terms of saying where we are in the valuation of 2016, but just to give you an indication of where we were at the last training evaluation of 2013. Funding level was 76%, so that's to say our assets equated to just over 3/4 of the value of the liabilities that were identified at that point in time, and the average employer rate on the back of that was 19.8%. So in terms of where we were in 2013, that was the overall position. Individual employers within that would vary slightly. Total number of members at that point in time was just short of 38,500. So that's my basic introduction. Just to give you a date for the diary, I should have said at the start of this, this meeting is actually being videoed and will be available. So any employers that aren't here today will have the opportunity to view the video and to hear what's being said at the meeting today. Every year we have our annual meeting. This year it's on 2nd of December, and we invite anybody along in relation to the pension fund. And this year the agenda, we're looking at LTPS pooling. So this is I won't talk about it in detail now, but this is the project that's being undertaken across the country to merge the pension funds from the 8990 pension funds across the country into a number of pools, and within Shropshire County Pension Fund is within the LGPS central pool, basically with a number of funds across the West Midlands. And this is about pooling the assets to reduce the costs of investment and increase potentially increase the return from those investments. So that should be quite an interesting item for those of you that are interested in the way in which the pension fund operates going forward. There'll also be an overview of fund investment performance. It's been a mixed year over the last year, but it gives an overview of where those investments have been made and how that performance has gone over the last 12 months. We always bring along one of our investment managers who provides an opportunity to talk and to explain what they're doing with the pension fund's money. This year we've invited Aberdeen along, and they're our property manager, so they're due to give an interesting talk around what we do with property investments across the UK and Europe. And there was also an update in relation to the fund administration. So Debbie will be up again to talk through the main issues for pension fund and members in terms of pensions administration. So if you'd like to book a place, you can go on the website or call up. Again, that meeting will be filmed. I checked on YouTube last night, and the annual meetings going back to 2012 are all there, available for you to watch. So if you've got a spare couple of hours at any point, so there's 5 now. So I think that qualifies as a box set. So look at that on Netflix over the next few minutes. Okay, so at this point, I will hand over to John and Mark, and they will take you through the main meetings.
Hello everyone, and good morning. Nice to see so many familiar faces. Another year older, another year on, another year older, another year greyer. Certainly in my case, anyway. But welcome everyone. What we're going to do over the next hour or so is just give you a little bit of background to the 2016 Actuarial Valuation process and the main effects. I'm going to kick off with an introduction, then I'm going to hand over to Mark to run through the numbers at the overall fund level. I'll put him in the stocks instead of me this year. It'll be a little bit later on in the morning that we give out the individual results. Okay, so James mentioned a little bit about the actuarial valuation process and what we do and how we go about our work. Now the actuarial valuation process is a little bit like drawing up a set of long-term accounts for the pension fund, looking at what is expected to pay out in the future. So what we do first of all is we look at the balance sheet side of things. First of all, we look at the level of existing assets, and we compare that against how much we believe the fund is going to need actually in there to be able to pay the benefits in the future. So in putting all that together, we need to know, and we need to make estimates about the future investment returns of the fund, the future levels of inflation, future pay growth of active members, in order to estimate the benefits that are going to go out in the future and what the current value of those benefits is at the current time. The difference between the value of that liabilities and the assets represents the funding shortfall, the deficiency, the deficit if you like, which has got to be paid off over a number of years. And we need to draw up a plan to be able to ensure that deficit is paid off and recovered so that the fund can pay out its benefits in the future. Now that's the benefits that are built up to date. Alongside that, we also need to calculate what the cost is of benefits building up in the future. And again, we need to make the same sort of estimates and the same sort of carry out the same sort of calculations in relation to investment returns and what's going to happen to inflation in the future. The calculation there is slightly different because for the benefits building up in the future, we don't have any we don't have any existing assets backing those. The assets to back those future benefits are going to be provided by future contributions. So instead really of looking at investment returns on existing assets, we're making more of an estimate on what the future investment returns are on money's going to be invested in the future. And that gives us a slightly different methodology of calculation in relation to benefits which are going to be earned in the future. Okay, so just to put that in a little bit more graphically, what we're trying to do is get the level of the fund topped up so that at any particular point in time we've got a target of having it 100% funded, so that the existing assets are enough to cover the liabilities, the benefits that are built up. Now, you've got a representation of the fund there in front of you by the funnel, and what you have to bear in mind in all of this is that the benefits due to come out of the scheme in the future, they're not really under the employer's control. They're not under the fund's control. They are determined by legislation. Those benefits are written down in statute. The other area that is written down in statute as well are the level of member contributions. So, to the extent that there is a funding shortfall in there are two things that can make up that funding shortfall. There's the level of investment returns that you earn in the future, and the level of contributions, the amount of contributions that is going to be paid over to the fund in the long term by employers to rectify any deficit that is in there at the moment. And the valuation process takes both of those into account. Looking at the the level of investment returns that are anticipated to be earned in the future, and the length of time over which the employers are given to pay off the funding shortfall that arises at any particular actuarial valuation. Now, this takes us on to some of the main details, and James gave us a very good introduction in terms of where we're coming from on this part of the valuation process. The main governance document for the fund and ourselves in terms of setting that valuation process and the valuation parameters is the funding strategy statement. The fund consults all stakeholders, including the employers, on that funding strategy statement. And as James mentioned, today is the start of that funding process. We'll say a little bit more about the detail of the consultation a little bit further on in the presentation, but just from an overall structural point of view, we've set out here the main areas which the funding strategy statement is designed to cover. You've got the objectives of the fund. You're trying to keep it at 100% funded by way of solvency, maintaining enough assets in there to be able to pay off the benefits as they fall due, and making sure that you maintain a sufficiently prudent funding plan so that you're not putting off costs which really ought to be met now, way off into the future. To the extent that there is a deficiency in the fund, you need a recovery plan to be able to pay off that deficit. And the funding strategy statement sets out the terms of that recovery plan. It sets out the length of the recovery period, how deficit contributions will be calculated, and whether there are any special provisions for any particular employers in there. It confirms the approach to how we work out the individual assets and liabilities for the fund. The fund isn't formally segregated, but we do run a notional level of assets for each employer, and we calculate that as part of each actuarial valuation. The solvency, the statement covers the solvency and long-term cost efficiency aims that I referred to those before. The actuarial assumptions, the investment returns that we assume will be earned, the levels of inflation, the levels of life expectancy, longevity. And finally, it refers back to the fund and employer policies in terms of how they support the funding strategy statements and how any variations are dealt with if an employer exits or joins the fund, for instance. Now, in terms of the funding framework, one of the key drivers of the actuarial valuation process is how much we're going to earn by way of investment returns. And it's not, the key driver is not quite so much how much by way of investment returns in absolute terms the fund will earn in future, but what will those asset returns be compared to CPI? Because all the benefits of the fund are linked to CPI, or pay growth, but in essence, they're all linked to inflation one way or another. So in formulating an investment policy, in formulating a funding plan, you need to bear in mind that inflation target, and the fund needs of adopting an approach which can reliably beat the inflation target, and that's something that we take account when we are doing our calculations. So there's really two aspects to this. You've got the long-term expectations of CPI. That really impacts on the value which is placed on the fund's liabilities, because we know that the fund's liabilities have to go up in line with CPI in the future. And that drives the contribution rates and the amount of the fund assets that we need to hold in relation to the benefits which we've built up to date. But alongside that, if you've got short-term variations from your assumed long-term CPI coming through in practice, then that will cause variations in the funding level at any particular point in time. And we'll see a little bit later on that there are, with low levels of inflation that we've experienced over the last 3 years, there is a little bit of profit coming through as a result of that into the funding positions. But one of the key questions for the fund is, how do you invest against that CPI target? How do you aim to reliably beat that target? And to what extent can we allow for that when we're going through the actuarial valuation process and doing our calculations?
Right. So John's mentioned briefly the importance of the investment return. How do we go about setting an assumption for that, and what are the details of it? We call it the discount rate. I'll explain briefly the concept for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Some of you maybe who've been to these presentations in the past. Basically, the fund has to pay out money in the future in terms of benefit payments. Part of that, as John said, we pay by contributions, part of it by investment returns. What we do as part of the valuation, we estimate what those benefit payments will be in the future, and then when we calculate the amount of money we need now to pay it, we make allowance for the investment returns we expect to earn. So as an example, if you've got to pay, say, £100,000 in 10 years' time, well, that's what you estimate. You need to decide how much money you need to hold now. If you allow for investment returns in a quite prudent way, you might come up with a figure of, say, £85,000. If you were more optimistic, you might get to £70,000. Depends on the assumption you pick. But that process of taking an amount of money you have to pay in the future and estimating the amount of money you need to hold now to pay it is called discounting. Just to give you a little background. So how do we set the discount rate for the fund? We start by considering each of the fund's assets individually. It's got various holdings, you can see them there. Relatively significant proportion in equities, which we hope will generate a higher return, and so more investment returns and help with keeping contributions lower. They also invest in other areas. They spread their money around to make sure there's not too much risk in one place, to try and make sure there's a suitable match versus the liabilities, to try and make sure things are done in a sensible and considered way. So what we will do as part of the valuation, for each of those different investment types, we'll come up with a best estimate of how we think those investments will do over the long term against CPI inflation. We'll then combine all that together to come up with a best estimate for the fund as a whole. In this case, you can see at the bottom right, our 50-50 best estimate might be that the fund's investments over long term will return 3.25% above inflation. So that's our starting point. But then we need to make an adjustment to our some prudence. There's two reasons we do that. Firstly, in the laws and the regulations that govern the LGPS, you have to build in an element of prudence, an element of safety when you're setting your assumptions, when you're setting your strategy. And secondly, it's just good practice. If you set a discount rate or your assumptions generally based on kind of your 50-50 best guess, that means essentially there's a 50% chance you're not paying enough, so contributions have to go up in the future. You might be passing on problems to future generations and so forth. So what we then do, we say, okay, if 3.25%, if that discount rate gives us a 50% chance of success, what discount rate gives us a 60% chance of succeeding, 65 and so forth. And as you seek more certainty, the expected return has to be lower, as you'd expect. And when we set the discount rate, it's all about balancing those two things. We don't want a discount rate that is too high and exposes the fund and the fund members and employers to too much risk. But you also don't want to go too low, because, as I've said, lower discount rates will mean higher contributions and more kind of cost pressures on employers. So where we arrived at this, in this case, we actually ended up at about a discount rate of CPI plus 2.35%, which corresponds to a probability of achieving that of around about 63%. So that's kind of the margin difference we've built in. Worth noting briefly, this is how we calculate the deficit, and so the deficit contribution is the balance sheet position. When we calculate the future service, the percentage rate you pay for the benefits being built up as you go along, we use a more optimistic assumption. In this case, it gave out 2.75%, so corresponding to probability of about 55, 60, that sort of range. The reason we do that is historic reasons. It's partly to alleviate cost pressures on employers a little bit, to try and keep that future service rate at a more manageable level. The reason we feel we can do that is because in the context of the fund, the benefits earned in one particular year are relatively small versus the overall liabilities, the overall benefits you've got to pay. So you can afford to be a little more optimistic, a little closer to your best estimate there if you've got the prudence when you set in the deficit. So valuation key points. I've talked about the discount rate at some length already, the 2.35%. One point that is worth noting on the future service rate, the percentage rate we calculate, the 2.75% is a slight reduction from last time's valuation, where we used a figure of 3. The reasons for that is we've adjusted somehow how we calculate the deficit. We've made that a bit less prudent, so hopefully resulting in, generally speaking, slightly lower deficits and lower deficit contributions. The trade-off was we needed to have a little bit more prudence in the future service rate so that we weren't pushing things out too much overall. And that leads us to a broad position where you're going to see future service rates up a little bit, deficit contributions down quite a bit compared to where they otherwise would have been. Other things on the assumptions, probably the other one to note is the short-term pay growth. We're assuming in the next 4 years, pay will grow in line with the government's projections for the public sector, 1% a year for 4 years. That brings about quite significant savings in terms of keeping the deficit contributions down. Because although benefits are no longer linked to pay going forward, all the benefits that were earned up to 3rd of March 2014 still have that link. You can't sever it, or it's not being severed. So as you award higher or lower pay increases, all those benefits, they kind of go up or down in line with that. So we assumed a lower rate of salary growth in the short term, which again has some positive impacts on their contributions. We also reviewed the demographic assumptions. I'll come to that later. Probably the other main point to note is the recovery period. This tends to provoke fairly strong opinions from people. And, you know, if any of you feel moved to yell at me about the deficit recovery period, I'll remind you you're on camera. So try and keep it clean. The principles we set when we consider the recovery period, the main one is that it should be coming down. If you're an open employer who's expected to be in the fund for a reasonable period of time, we'll be looking to reduce the deficit recovery as a starting point by 3 years, every 3-year valuation, which makes sense. If you're not reducing it, then you're not paying off your deficit. It's like you've got an interest-only mortgage, you're only paying the interest, you're not addressing the fundamental problem. So that's sort of the base position we start with. Also, one thing we're looking at as part of this valuation, for employers who would otherwise see a reduction in contributions, what we're going to do instead is reduce the deficit recovery period and keep the total contributions the same. The reason for this is that, firstly, we don't think it's kind of appropriate for employers with potentially still large deficits within the fund to be taking a reduction in contributions. It's better to keep contributions stable and adjust the recovery period to match that. And this is in line with kind of the long-term overarching requirements in the LGPS regulations. The idea is, as much as possible, we should keep contributions stable. And so this is one way of doing that. So into valuation experience. What this is broadly, it's some of the key factors that have taken us from the position we had last time to the position we're going to see shortly for this valuation, some of the main drivers. I'll pick out some of the key ones. Investment returns were very good over the intervaluation period. The fund returned about 25% over the 3 years, so around about 8% a year, which is very good. It's also well above the discount rate that we assumed last time. So all that extra investment return means, again, improvement in the funding position, lower contributions. The other thing that John has alluded to, the CPI increases. Last time we assumed CPI for the long term as a whole would be about 2.6% a year. And over the last 3 years in total, the increases have only been about just over 3%. So there's quite a big gain there that's come through for pretty much all employers. As John said, in some way or other, all the benefits are linked to inflation or CPI. So these the low levels over the last few years have really come through and brought through savings for everyone. Other one to mention, probably pay increases. This is another thing that might provoke a strong reaction. As part of the last valuation, we assumed pay had increased at 1% a year on average. Now what we've seen when we've looked at the data is it, on average, across the fund as a whole, it was somewhat above that. And so that's brought through losses for employers overall. It's brought through a cost. Depends on employers greatly, but we're looking at kind of 1 to 2% of liabilities on average. A couple of things to bear in mind in that, because I can feel people thinking we haven't had pay rises anywhere like that. It's not your overall pay bill that matters. It's the pay increases you give to people who've been in the fund throughout the whole period. It's the increase on those benefits that are linked to their final pay. And it includes anything, promotions, increments. It's not just your pay increase. And I'll re-emphasise that this will vary, this particular, more than any of the other factors, will vary a lot by employer. And you will see your own numbers later in the schedules we give out. But at a whole fund level, we are seeing a cost coming through from that. So, as John alluded to, as part of valuation of various assumptions, these ultimately dictate what the balance sheet is, what the contributions are. Some of the key assumptions, what's happened to them. I've already mentioned the discount rate, so I won't dwell on that. Short-term pay assumption, again, is bringing through savings in the past service, but it doesn't affect that percentage rate because the benefits being built up now are no longer linked to pay in the long term. The other main factor is life expectancy here, which has brought through savings on both the past and future service. The experience has been, I won't say good, I'll say favourable from a pension fund point of view. Overall, we've seen slightly higher rates of death than we expected, which brought through a small saving. This is also fed through into the assumptions going forward, where we expect overall slightly lower life expectancies, and obviously from a pensions standpoint purely, that's a good thing. It means pensions are paid for less time, so they aren't quite as costly. And then we reviewed all the other assumptions as well as various demographic ones in there. I won't dwell on them all. The one I will touch on briefly is the 50-50 option. It won't affect most employers, but there were the odd one last time who took a reduction in the contribution rate, the percentage, to allow for the possibility that people might join the new 50-50 scheme that came in from 2014, whereby essentially you pay half the contributions, get half the benefits. This actually hasn't proved to be very popular at all. Very few people have taken it up, so those savings haven't emerged. So we're not allowed for that this time. So for the odd employer who did bill that in, they'll be looking at a bigger increase in that percentage rate. I don't know what I've done. Here we are. Valuation rules, of course. I'm trying to build the suspense a lot more. Briefly, on the left in grey, you see last time's position. James already touched on funding level 76%, corresponds to a deficit of £380 million in 2013. The percentage future service rate across the fund as a whole was 14%, so that's just for the benefits building up. So it's useful to look at what that would mean in pounds terms for the next financial year, which is I'm sure where your interest is. If we applied the same strategy, what would be happening is next year deficit contributions for the fund as a whole, on average, if you like, would be £19.2 million for 16 years, which is what's left of the recovery period that we set as standard for the fund as a whole. There's some variation in that, but 16 years left as the standard. The future service contributions will be about £32 million for overall contributions of 51 million across the fund as a whole. So on the right, we've got the results emerging from this valuation. The deficit's down by about 25%, by about £100 million, which is obviously good news, although I'm obviously more to say on that in a second. But the deficit's down, driven largely by the positive investment returns that we've seen. A few of the other factors I've mentioned, the CPI are a reasonably significant increase as well. So that's brought that down. Funding level now 84%, so you've got enough assets to cover 84% of those payments you need to make in the future on our estimates. The future service rate, as I've said, is up because of the change in the discount rate principally, so by about 0.7% at fund level, although that will vary again by a bit employer to employer. Now what does this mean again in terms of pounds amounts for next year as a comparison? Deficit contributions are down slightly from 19.2 million to 18.6. Now you would look at the deficit, you would look at the deficit and you would expect that to be a lot more. You would expect it to come down by about 25%, so about £5 million. But what we did as part of the last valuation, because obviously in 2013, as you are now, everyone was facing significant funding pressures, cost pressures. So what we did, we actually allowed for experience between the valuation date of 30 and August 13 and markets improved quite a bit. So that 19.2 million, the theoretical deficit contribution figure for next year, is based on a deficit at August 13 of about £275 million. So that explains the movement you've seen a little better. The deficit in terms of contributions is broadly flat, so deficit contributions are down slightly because of a few of the other factors for a small saving. Future service contributions are up for the reasons I've already discussed, percentage rate up slightly, and so we're looking at fund level as a whole, a small increase overall. And you've got an increase in future services saving in deficit. I'll stress again, probably won't be the last time, this can vary quite a lot employer to employer, and you'll see results later. But as a whole fund level, this is what we're seeing. So when it comes to getting your own results, you'll get a schedule much like this. And this sets out, in similar to the last slide, on the left you've got your actual funding position from last time. On these schedules we've put your August position on, in terms of your deficit, so it corresponds to your contributions, make things hopefully a little more intuitive for you. At the bottom you've got your projected contributions for the next 3 years, based on your payroll and evaluation and so forth, and your what's left of the current recovery period. On the right you've got your 2016 results. Again, you have your deficit, your balance sheet figures, and your percentage future service rate. At the bottom, you have your projected contributions for the next 3 years. Now, those deficit contributions, 2017 through 2020, those are your actual figures. And there may be at some point some discussion with the fund or with ourselves about possible flexibilities for employers facing increases. But these are, as a base, your contributions, your starting figures, if you like, they'll be what you expect to pay. One of the things to note on here, you'll notice the recovery period hasn't come down by 3 years as you might expect, and it's not anymore a whole number. That links back to what I was saying earlier about employers who would otherwise be facing a reduction. That reflects the fact that we brought in the recovery period to keep the total contributions at a similar level. Second page of the schedule will be this. It just gives you a bit more context as to what's going on. In the top left, you've got your reconciliation of the balance sheet from last time to this. Show the main things that have caused the movements in your particular employer. So you'll be able to see the impact of your own pay increases, your own sort of membership experience, that sort of thing. And then on the right, there'll be the movement in your future service rate, the change in your percentage rate. For the vast majority of you, that'll be a change of about 0.4 to 0.6% due to the assumption for the discount rate, principally. And then the rest of it will be due to the change in your individual member profile. It's probably worth noting that particularly under the new scheme since 2014, these percentage contributions can vary quite a bit depending on your age profile. For very young employers, the contribution can be like up to 10%, but for older employers it can easily get above 25%. There's a lot of variation by age. So if your membership profile has changed a lot, you can potentially get larger changes in your future service rate to reflect this. And then the box below that is your experience over the 3-year period in some key things. The figure you'll be interested in is the one at the bottom. That's your actual salary growth. So that's the figure for your employer compared to the 1% a year, which is giving you the gain or loss. You can feel free to obviously come and tell me that figure's nonsense, as I'm sure some of you will. Finally, there's a membership summary at the bottom as well. Just note briefly, for any new employers where this is the first evaluation, you only have the membership summary because you won't have the 3 years experience to build up the things at the top, the intervaluation factors. I think I've probably gone on about long enough. Just to summarise a few of the key messages, really hammer them home. Broadly speaking, we expect future service rates to be up by around about 1% of pay overall. Similarly, we'd expect deficit contributions to be down because of favourable investment performance and one or two other factors. Overall, which factor is dominant will vary very much employer to employer. If you've got a very high payroll relative to your deficit and your liabilities, then the first factor might be dominant. If your payroll is quite small, you may gain more from the reduction in deficit contributions. Finally, as I've said, the figures you will see are your base starting contributions. There may be some allowance for phasing of increases, but that'll be discussed after this meeting, possibly at a later date. So I think that's all from me. I'll pass you back to John, who's just going to go through funding strategy.
Probably a useful opportunity there just to take a break and say, look, are there any particular questions at this point? I think just to sort of pull out some of the particular issues. Sorry, I'll go back to the mic again. Just to pull out some particular things here. What you are going to see coming through from the valuation reports is that if you're what we refer to as an employer with an immature profile, so you've got lots of active members, you've come into the fund fairly recently, if for instance you're not well funded, and that sort of scenario would apply particularly, say, to an academy employer, then you might well not see the results coming through too well for you, or you might see a bigger increase in contributions for yourselves than the average. I mean, one of the reasons for that is that because you're new and an academy's come into the fund with an existing deficit, you don't actually have much by way of asset allocation to earn the investment returns on over the last 3 years. So the investment profits that the fund as a whole has seen probably won't apply to you. Now, at the other extreme, if you've got, if you're an employer that has been in the fund for quite a while, and I mean, I guess if you're say a very mature housing association, perhaps with a closed, with an employer with a membership that's been closed for some time, and particularly if your position is well funded, what you're going to see is the investment returns. The investment return gains for you as a percentage of pay, because your pay has dropped off, are going to be quite high, and probably the reduction in the deficit contributions for you is going to outweigh the increase in future service contributions that are coming through. So there is going to be a lot of variance by profile of employer coming through with this actuarial valuation.
John?
Yeah.
And you seeing anything different in the Shropshire Fund than other funds you're working with?
No, the picture is generally consistent. I mean, it's we're seeing the same sort of effects coming through from for pretty much all our funds. I mean, one of the key things that comes through is the investment returns, and the investment returns are so much driven by what's going on in the investment markets generally, that you will see different scales of that, where you are generally seeing investment returns being pretty favourable, and helping with the deficits a little bit.
What about the change in salaries? Because I know you commented, Mark mentioned it in his presentation. And the issue with Shropshire, you have seen this sort of slight increase across some other employers that you wouldn't have expected. Is that just local?
Okay, so if you didn't hear, Debbie's asking about the thing that we've referred to about increases in salaries and whether that's a general issue across the LGPS or not. We found that it is a general issue across the LGPS in terms of increases in pay that are coming through. We don't know exactly why. I think the reasons seem to vary a little bit from one employer to another. But some of the features that we've seen coming through are, sometimes there are still job evaluation schemes coming through, and the effects of them, and those increasing pay levels. You also, I suspect, see a little bit of, because as a knock-on effect of the funding cuts, in that because many public sector employers are are still going through the austerity measures, are having the funding cuts, they're having to go through reorganisations. And actually, whilst people might leave as a result of some of those reorganisations, very often what does happen is that the people who remain behind, their jobs get expanded and they end up taking on more responsibilities and their pay goes up as a result of that. And that, that does increase the liabilities of the fund, because you're giving people who are already in there more pay rises than you would normally have expected. So those do seem to be the common themes, really. Yeah.
From what we've heard so far, it sounds more positive than expected. Certainly, I know a lot of colleges were quite shocked when they got their FRS 17, or whatever we should call it that, valuation. And I wasn't quite sure whether this relative good news, certainly very good news compared to what I was expecting, is that a reflection of, with Solent, the colleges having their accounting valuation done at 31st of July in the aftermath of Brexit and falling bond yields, or was it to do with the fact that the accounting valuation is on a different basis to the funding valuation? Why is it? Why are we getting the good news basically?
It's a bit of both. The methodology for working out the discount rates for the FRS 102 calculations is different from the one that we use for working out the discount rate for the actuarial valuation. We are essentially this time around looking at expected returns from the entire existing asset portfolio. Whereas if you're using FRS 102, you've got to use a discount rate which is calculated according to corporate bond yields. So a bit, a technical difference between the two. And then the other thing that you mentioned as well is corporate bond yields, the gilt yields of all bond yields have reduced substantially, both in run-up to and the aftermath of Brexit. So they're all at historically low levels. They've come back a little bit, but they're the levels that they're at are still very low. Yeah.
I'm an employer in 3 different funds, so I've got 3 weeks through these meetings. And what's striking me actually is the difference in assumptions between the different funds. And we have no choice. We can't amalgamate everything into one fund or choose our favourite or do anything clever. We just have to sort of take it. But there's some, quite dramatic differences in some assumptions, which will have quite dramatic differences in contribution rate. I just wonder if you have any comments on that going forward, because I can only see us being in more funds.
Yeah, are you a contractor?
No, I'm a multi-academy trust.
Oh right, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, yes, you are going to see different assumptions coming through as a result of, I guess, sort of different outlooks by different administrative authorities and different outlooks by different firms of actuaries as well. I think the thing I would say is that we'll come on to it in the second presentation later on. Is that the assumptions are coming under more scrutiny than they have done in the past. And that may lead to some degree of more of the assumptions coming together as we move forward. I think that will happen as a general trend, but it may take a little while.
I can't see what the advantage is to me to have 3 different bodies, 3 different sets of assumptions, 3 different contribution rates, when the benefits essentially.
Yeah. I mean, investment return outlook is, the investment policies of the different funds may be different as well. All you can do is feed in by way of consultation to the funding strategy statement. But as a relatively small employer within the fund, which most academies do tend to be, you'll find that your voice gets diluted amongst all the other employers as well. I certainly can't promise that all the funds are going to use the same assumptions in the next valuation cycle or two. Yeah, I'll move on. Oh yeah.
Would you be giving us a copy of these slides, or are they available?
Yeah, there are. Right, yeah, there are a few hard copies of the slides if you want them, and I think they're.
I will send them out after the meeting.
They will be made available in PDF form after the meetings.
I'll just ask a slightly technical question. Are the mortality tables, which one are you using now?
We are using they're a table. They're called the SAPS 2 tables, if that means anything to you. But they're based on the experience of UK pension schemes as a whole, adjusted for the profile of the Shropshire County Pension Fund.
So what year did they go up to? 3 years?
Okay. Well, if you incorporate the Shropshire experience that we've allowed for. We've allowed for experience up to the end of 2015, I think. Yeah, we've allowed for the profile of the Shropshire schemes history in 2015. Sorry.
The mortality evidence reflects in there.
Yeah, that's in there. Okay. A little bit about the funding strategy statements and the consultation. The funding strategy statement, as it stands in draft at the moment, it will be emailed out to all employers for their information for consultation on there, and there's going to be a 4-week consultation period on this. Holding hands up that almost by necessity, the document is of itself actually quite a long one. It's quite a meaty governance document for the fund as a whole, and there's a reasonable amount of regulatory stuff that really has to go in there, as it's the only place for it. So I'm not saying take it away, just sort of read it and come back with a line by line commentary on it. But in terms of the consultation process, I think the particular things that are probably right for you as employers to focus on are the appropriateness of the assumptions, and especially for you, whether you think what we're assuming on future pay growth is right for you or not. It would probably be difficult to go below 1% for the next few years allowance, but if you wanted to make extra provision for more in your case, then you might well be able to adopt your contribution plans to suit. The proposals in relation to the deficit recovery plan, in particular, we're talking about maintaining the existing recovery plan. But also, in general, maintaining the existing contribution levels over and above that. Now, if you feel that there's a reason why that's not appropriate for you as an employer, and that, there might be one or two out there where there's a particular reason why that shouldn't happen, and that the approach ought to be more flexible, then the door's open for a discussion on that. At the moment, the contribution schedules that will be handed out later on don't have any allowance for any increase in contributions to be phased in or stepped. If that's an issue for you against existing budgets, and you can produce a plan by way increases will be stepped and get you up to the required levels. Again, that's something that the fund would be quite happy to discuss. And if there's any particular features in your case that make that challenging, then do feel free to tell us, and feel free to tell the fund, and I'm sure there will be a number of discussions to be had along those lines. Okay, so that's the funding strategy statement, actually. So that's probably at the end on that one. Any particular queries, comments that anyone wants to raise before I move on to the next bit? Yeah, okay.
John, I'm not clear how we get hold of a copy of the strategy statements and how we actually make comments to you with that line for that.
Yeah, the draft as it stands is going to be emailed out after this, and you've got 4 weeks from is it 4 weeks from today, James, and it's 4 weeks today to come back to the fund with comments on it. Yeah.
Just on that, will we get that email out today? I'm meeting on Monday to basically call my council with this information. And it gives me a day or so to go through it.
Yeah, I'll do it this afternoon. John can give me the draft this afternoon. I'll get it sent out to you all along with the slides.
Okay. Thanks, Beth. Okay.
So the current strategy is on our website along with all of our other policies. So I'll put a link into that as well.
Right. Now, just sort of by way of background introduction into this, the scrutiny in the LGPS is coming about in a number of ways, in a number of guises, and there are there are several bodies who are interested in supervising the LGPS and making sure that it's run properly. The pensions regulator is looking at data provision and governance. Debbie's going to talk a little bit about that later on. The Scheme Advisory Board is looking at funding and solvency and employer covenant, and the Government Actuaries Departments are also doing reviews into the scheme's funding and the approaches taken by each fund. And one of the areas which is coming under more scrutiny from the pensions regulator and from the Scheme Advisory Board is in relation to employer covenant and the affordability of the scheme going forward as against employers' finances. So what the Shropshire Fund is planning to do is have a light touch review of employer covenants. If you like, looking at the balance sheet and looking at balance sheet against the pension liabilities, looking at employer income and expenditure against the contributions that they have to pay. It's going to do this in a pretty light way, and if it's already got the data available, then it will use that data. But for some employers, it may mean coming out to you for a little bit more data on some of the on some more of your background finances. We're trying to keep it light touch. We're trying to keep the information relatively simple, so that what we're looking at is not overcomplicated and can be understood by the fund and the approach understood by the employers as well. So the data request as it comes out for those employers where we're going to need it is just really going to be around your total income in financial years and what your balance sheet is as disclosed in your latest set of accounts. So it's not going to be the data request is up there. So it's not going to be terribly intrusive. The idea is to make it light touch and proportionate, and it may well not apply for all employers, but the fund and all LGPS funds are under a fair amount of pressure to be seen to be taking action in this area, and the Actuarial Valuation Time is one to do it. Now, in practice, the fund may well decide that there are groups of employers where this is unnecessary. It doesn't need to particularly those which are dependent on government funding streams. For instance, it might well decide that that this is over the top and it's not going to go down this route. So don't be surprised if one of these data requests doesn't come through to you. But for some employers, it might well mean a longer, harder look at the deficit plans. You know, in some cases, for instance, it might be that the fund comes back and says, well, can you give us a little bit more security, for instance? You know, have you got any assets that you can offer security against? Or you know, can you give us can you give us an insurance bond against the deficit which you're currently holding in the scheme? So those sort of discussions will probably go on for the next few months in the road to signing off the formal actuarial evaluation. What we will actually do is try and sort of take a proportionate approach, sort of looking at the overall financial position of the employer against its pension fund liabilities. Again, to try and make the approach proportionate, to try and make it reasonable, and not make it overburdensome either from the employer perspective or from the fund's perspective. Okay, so just to wrap up, I think James essentially went through the timeline. So I'll not repeat what he said, but what we're really aiming to do is get feedback on the funding strategy statements in early December, and then try and from there wrap up all the discussions on the employer contribution rates going forward for the next 3 years, within the next month or two after that. So we can sign everything off by the statutory deadline of March 2017. Yeah.
In terms of the employer covenant and getting feedback on that, is there a perception by a regulator or yourselves as actuaries in terms of changing the employer covenant as a general to LGPS schemes?
I don't think there's a particular change in the nature of the covenant that has been that is offered by employers to the fund. I don't really think that has fundamentally changed. I think what has come about is more of a drive to more scrutiny within the LGPS, and it's that drive to more scrutiny which is really driving the appetite for the covenant reviews. I mean, I think the historic view has really been one of, well, if you look at any LGPS fund, then then 90% of its assets and liabilities are sort of publicly funded bodies. So is it really that big a problem? And I think there's a bit more of an attitude now of, well, actually, yes, it is all public money that's at risk if an employer leaves the fund and leaves its liabilities behind. And is that increased scrutiny within the fund is the sort of general increased political scrutiny world in which we live now that I think is driving that, rather than a change in the employer base.
And I suppose slightly different tack that could impact on the employer covenant could be thinking about legislation changes or reviewing those, the government's appetite for career average pensions or pension age and things like that they can fed in or assumptions around that in the valuation.
Yeah, I think there are there are two angles to that. I mean, if there were if there were government legislation that were going to affect the LGPS that we knew about, then yes, you know, we would feed that into the background calculation side. I guess the other angle to that is there government legislation in train which will affect employers' funding or their ability to their ability to meet the costs, their general solvency financially, and I guess to an extent reliance on employers telling us the effect of that in their projected financial positions going forward, really. I mean, the fund, the fund officers will know about some of these changes, but they won't be able to appreciate the fine detail of all of them, given the fairly diverse nature of the employer base that it's got. Yeah.
In the assumptions, has there been a significant impact from, or has it been built in, the drive by Shropshire Council to devolve services to town and parish council? Has that impacted significantly on those town and parish council contributions and deficit profiles?
Okay, it will be. You'll get the same effects coming through as for the main employers. So I think where that's happened, I think where you will still get the flavour of sort of lower deficit contributions and higher future service contributions for town and for town and parish councils. What you do tend to find though is the town and parish councils do tend to be less mature in the profiles than the average in general. They tend to be newer employers on the whole and only recently admitted to the fund, so it tends to be the future service contributions which are more of an issue for the town and parish councils in general than the potential offset from the lower deficit contributions. But it's not, there's no, there isn't a direct link between between what the council's doing and what the fund's doing, certainly not.
If you were valuing the fund today, and I should say 31st March,
Yeah.
would there be anything that would make me feel differently about valuation?
Potentially quite a bit. That yeah. No, I mean, I think again we'll touch on the background to this a little bit in the session later on. Although we don't have any actual numbers, but in general, what we're seeing in the aftermath of Brexit and the run up to that, and I was going to say the US election as well, although that doesn't seem to have had that much effect on the markets. We are seeing a combination of markets going up, which an increase in asset value is good for the fund. It means the deficit is a little bit lower, just taking that in isolation. But on the other hand, I think there's also a feeling that we're potentially in a lower growth, higher inflation environment as well, which is bad for the liability side of things. So there are trade-offs. There could be effects, but we haven't worked out the numbers.
I'm Debbie Sharp. I look after the administration team that collects your money in, spams you with everything that you need to know. So please make sure that if you've got a spam filter, that you haven't put Rebecca on spam, please. I thought what I'd cover today, because we've got the valuation going on, a lot of you here to get your contribution rates. Basically, the data that you get to us is used by John to actually do your valuation calculation to set your employer's contribution rate. So it's talking through what do we need from you, why do we need from you. So our main function, especially for my team, actually, no matter how much money you want to pay us, how much money we pay out to John to do the number crunching for us, what we need to get to do at the end of the day is actually pay those benefits on time to the right people. The crux of it, that's what we do as a pension fund. So we're actually responsible for all of the local government employers in Shropshire, and the legislation dictates that it's Shropshire Council that looks after that. So it's not something we choose to do just because we've put our hand up and said, yes, we'll do that. We've actually been given that job to look after the whole area of Shropshire. And our employer base is growing year by year. Look at the audience today. It's great that we've got around about, I think, half of our employers here today. Our employer base is around about 140, 150 employers now, growing all the time. Academies are adding to that, and new contractors with outsourcings. There's been a couple of comments around town and parish councils, and as John said, a lot more town and parish councils are now looking to join. They've historically always been able to, but they haven't necessarily felt that they needed to. But especially now, with one of the comments raised, with some of the services transferring from the councils to the town and parish councils, we are looking at growing that base too. So, how do we do all of this? We're legislated quite heavily. Everything we do isn't just because we want to do it. It's not our choice to do it. We've got lots of legislation. You'll see here all sorts of regulations that we've got to adhere to for you. It's not just the local government pension scheme regulations. We've got the list there. I'm not going to read them out. Have a look at them. There's lots. Overarching HMRC rules dictate how much, even down to how much pension someone can have and how much we need to tax it. So lots of other legislation actually overlaps onto the local government pension scheme rules to ensure that we're actually doing the job that we need to do. Even down to data protection. There's lots. That's not actually the whole of the list that we have to be aware of, what we've got to be looking at and ensuring that we're complying to. Just a few there. Keeps us busy anyway. So, main ones, why do we collect the data off you? A lot of it comes under the local government pension scheme regulations. I've got administration regulations. Justin on his side has investment regulations, so there are two sets there. And different things come under the different sets of regulations. Administration is under the local government pension scheme regulations 2014 now, but those are the 2013 regulations. But this is where it gets complicated for my team. We've still got regulations brought forward from a number of previous sets. So we don't just have to look at the current set of rules. We've got protections and benefits being paid under many other previous sets that were laid down, and protections have been carried forward. We've got people who may have left back in the 1980s that still haven't drawn their benefits, but if they draw their benefits, they were calculated under previous rules, so not everything has been replaced for them. Public Service Pensions Act came in 2013, and that's introduced a bigger framework of governance across the whole of our area, really. We've got the Scheme Advisory Board now. We now have our own fund board, so we've got the Pensions Board now as well as Pensions Committee. We've got members of your Pensions Board are in the audience today, and they also attend their own board meetings, and we have representatives come to Pensions Committee. The regulatory oversight by the pensions regulator has been widened. They are now actually our regulators. They didn't have sort of that legislative backing of them previously. They were more in other funds, never in the public sector domain. So now we've got those that we've got to actually ensure that we're complying with any codes of practice or any legislation that comes out through that arena. And then public service record keeping, the one at the bottom, is, again, we've got our normal regulations. We're looking at how do we collect your money, how do we calculate the benefits, but then we've got this other set of rules now that have actually laid across all of ours about what and how do we keep our records. So that's been the push over the last few years, really, for some of the changes that are coming through of why we're dealing with you in a different way. It's it's because of this extra layer of governance that we've got to comply with. And us complying with it means that also there are employer responsibilities as well. So this year with the data that we've had from you, and as a fund historically, we've worked really, really well with you, and I think communication has helped in that, training, you're good employers, mostly. So this year, unlike a lot of other funds, we've been able to do most of the legislative things on time, which has been really great. Annual benefit statements were on time this year. We were on time last year, and there was only about 4 funds last year, which was the first year that we'd had to provide them after going into the care benefit scheme. But we managed it, and we managed it because you will get your data to us. We might have queries on it, we might have to hound you a bit for some of it, but mostly we get good data and on time. We've been able to do our savings statements for the annual allowance. That's under the HMRC rules. There is rules under the taxman, basically, that you as an employer have to get certain information to us on time to ensure we can get those statements out. Those statements aren't under any pensions rules, those are under the tax rules. But again, if you don't give us your data, and it's not good data, we can't get that out and we can't comply with the legislation. We submitted the valuation data on time to John. Hey. It's getting harder, it is getting harder, because we've got so much, you know, the employer base has grown. We're getting data from a lot of you. And this year, John touched on it in one of his presentations. There's a lot of other people now that are looking and trying to have a bit of governance over the local government pension scheme. They're interested in the funding levels, they're interested in what's going on. And we had a lot of other statutory requests over the summer. The government's actuaries department now is interested in data. We have to provide them with information we never used to have to provide before. So again, anything that we've been asked from all of the statutory bodies, we've been able to do on time as well. A lot of what we're doing day to day is laid down for you in one document. Becky said earlier, Rebecca Perfect, who you'll hear from, who's the Communications and Governance Officer, it's laid down in our policies. A big one for employers, if you're looking at your role as an employer and how you're actually communicating with us, is laid down in our pensions administration strategy. It says what's expected of you, and also what's expected of my team. So if we're ever not doing something that you think we should be doing, what does it tell you in the administration strategy that we should be doing for you? Have a look in there. It covers your statutory obligations. We've tried to write it in a way that if you adhere to what it says in there, then hopefully both parties are enabled to do what they need to do to comply with the statutory rules that are laid down in all of those sets of regulations. There are some fund preferences in some cases, how we like things. The regulations say you have to do it, but they also lay down that actually some of those things have to be in the way that we stipulate. So yes, we choose sometimes how we want you to give us that data, but usually that's to try and ensure that it's the easiest way that you and I can deal with it. But it is in there if we want something in a particular way or at a particular time, then we've popped it in there. We review it every year, update it. Sometimes it's just in changing terminology, but what we'll look at is, have we had any instances where things haven't worked on either side? What is working, what isn't? So feedback is always good on how we're working together, because we can look at improving things and seeing whether it needs to be built into this document. It's on the website. You've got a dedicated employers area. If you ever need to know anything, or if you've got new staff, have a look in the employers area. If you find it difficult to use, please feed that back to us as well. This is your documentation, your advice and guidance. If you can't find something, we need to know why you couldn't find it, and we can have a look at putting it in a different way. But everything is on there. This is you. I know pensions isn't your day job. It's my day job, and that's what we're dealing with. but you don't. This is partly tagged onto your job. There's not many of our employers that have dedicated pensions officers that actually deal with everything for them as their day-to-day role. So what does that mean for you as an employer? And we have been trying to work with employers for the last few years on this sort of area. It's getting more complex. Final salary became care scheme. That means your data needs to be held in a different way. You're having to deal with restructures, cutting back on staff. I know that. Our team, probably in the council, is one of the few that's growing. Our employer base is growing. Our employee number is growing. That's down to academies, auto-enrolment, all sorts of things. But it is a statutory obligation. We're just like the taxman. Some of these rules are laid down in statute. You know, they do go through Parliament. It's not just something that we're coming along and saying to you, we quite fancy having this. You have got some timescales to comply with that. If you don't, we don't. The fines aren't quite as big as what the taxman will levy on you, so you probably will give him slightly more priority over me. And we're probably far more amenable at working with you with getting the information from you. But I think one of the things, especially some of the finance staff we've got in here, if your teams that are dealing with this are under-resourced, then you really do need to have a look at this, because it is something you do have to do. Prioritising responsibilities, we're not always going to come first, we know that, but the pensions regulator now has oversight as well. There is a lot that they check up on, a lot more of the record that we now have to do. We're here to help though. One of the things is training, new staff come in. We do employer sessions each year like this. If you've got teams that need to have any more information on any topic or area, pensions, not any area, sorry, that you want us to help with, just give us a ring. We do pension surgeries, we do communication to your staff and that side of things. But remember, we can actually do it for the teams that are having to do this for their day job as well. We can put on the feedback sheet, I think today, it's got on there, is there anything you would like to be covered? We've run employer sessions before, like training sessions on what is pensionable pay, all sorts of things like that. We can do those again as often as people need them, really, but there's no point putting on training sessions if someone doesn't want to attend. We talked about in a bit this morning, pensions regulator is there now having a look at what we are doing as a whole, investments, administration, everything. So they're there to protect the benefits for the pension scheme members. Basically, that's what they're looking at doing. So again, it comes back to the right benefit to the right person, which is what we try to do. Most of the time we do it, but occasionally things will go awry, but that's what we're looking at doing. And why do they want to do it? They don't want people calling on the pension protection fund. That won't affect our fund, because we are a statutory fund. We're sort of underwritten. If one of our employers goes, ceases to exist, goes bust, stops trading, something like that, and has left debts, the debts are to the pension fund, the benefits are underwritten, so the employees don't lose out. What can happen, which goes back to John's mention about the covenants, if we haven't been able to secure the money for their debts from our company, they do get spread across the whole of the employers in our fund. So that's why we've got to look after those covenants for you. We need to have a look to ensure we know we're not putting all of our employers at risk by allowing an employer to leave us with some debts. They're aiming to try and improve the administration, that it's good administration, that we're actually doing what we need to do to communicate properly to those employees, educate your members. There is a Code of Practice 14 which was introduced when their regulatory role was introduced last year, and that provides lots of guidance on the sort of the functions that we're doing and the responsibilities and what is on the fund to actually do. And a lot of that actually overlaps with you as employers, so a lot of the language in it is ensure that the data being provided by the employers is accurate, ensure that your record keeping is robust. So it's on both of us but some of it isn't. So that's why we're working towards ensuring we've got ways of, if the pension regulator comes knocking on our door, we can say, well, we've got this procedure in place, we've got this, we know how we get their data. Yes, we've got different checks and balances in place that would give us an assurance that we can say that we think our employers do give us robust, good, clean data. Website, you can take that away. As we said earlier, all of these presentations will be available afterwards on PDF. If you want to have a look what their code of practice is or anything, if you want to, there's links on our website as well. But our push at the moment is on those areas at the end there, so internal controls, record keeping, that's ours and yours, and the communication that we give out to our members. And part of that would be, say, the annual benefit statement. That's only a good communication if the information in it is of actually of high quality, and the information used in the annual benefit statement basically comes down to what you tell us. So if you don't give us the correct final salary, pensionable pays, and the right care pay to get that care pot building up correctly, that benefit statement actually isn't a good quality document. So that's why we need that data from you. So what we're pushing for at the moment, a couple of our bigger employers are now giving us their data, actually feeding it directly through electronically. And you can see there we've had, since August last year, so just over a year, between those two employers alone, we had over 500,000 data changes that came directly from their payroll system through onto our administration system. So that's why our workload is also increasing, because of course most of those data changes mean that we need to then go into that record and possibly make a change. Some of the system will do deal with some of those changes automatically, whereas others will be creating some work for my team. So that new members, if we find out about a new member, we need to write to them. That's part of your statutory obligations as well, bringing in new members. We need to ensure we've given them the information that the legislation says they should have as a new member. Leavers have to, in legislation, if somebody leaves you, they have to, within 3 months, be told what their benefit entitlements are. So that's why we need fast information from you. We need to know if someone's left. There's no point telling us at the end of the year that somebody left in the previous May. We may not have then actually adhere to the codes. One size doesn't fit all. The bigger funds can do extracts from their payroll, and they will feed it through a service that feeds it directly into our scheme. Some of the smaller employers will have a portal that you will just do online, so we will be contacting everybody slowly over the next sort of few months to work with you to know what's going to, which method will actually suit you for your data transfer. And this is your monthly transfers, your changes each month, the care data for the individuals. And again, by collecting it monthly at the end of the year, it makes the job easier, because we've been having 12 instances to pick up any changes. We're not looking at getting to the end of the year as we have historically, and find across the fund as a whole we might have actually not been told of upwards of sort of several thousand employees have joined the fund, and we haven't actually been told about them through the year. We find out historically at the end of the year, we used to find out a lot about how many people had left that we hadn't been notified of. So it's going back again to this new raft of legislation and governance that's out there to say we need to ensure that the record keeping is robust. So watch this space. You will be being contacted, and we will work with you to get the new systems up and running for you. Most of them, we introduce the monthly data collection in a way that hopefully you're already providing this information. It's just going to be delivered to us in a different way. What if it all goes wrong? Happens sometimes. Another thing that was introduced last year, if something went wrong before, we just work, we just get it sorted. We might get a couple of complaints, we might get a few members going through the internal disputes resolution procedure, IDRP mostly referred to. But nowadays it's actually classed as a breach. It's got a word, it's been attached to it, and basically if you break or fail to absorb, you or I, anything that is laid down in all of those sets of legislation that I showed you, we have to record it. So just another job for my team to do now. It's, you know, we used to know that when things went wrong before, but you would just sort them. Now, down to the record keeping, we have to show that we actually know what is going wrong. We're doing something about it. And actually, sometimes we may even need to report it. So it has to be reported to the pensions regulator. So it's not just about recording and knowing what we're doing wrong now. We have to actually make an assessment as to whether what has gone wrong, is it a breach, and basically then report it. But it's not just the pension fund that the legislation sort of is stating has to actually report this. The onus is on anybody who touches the fund, basically. So pension board, if they think that we're doing something wrong, scheme manager, me, or James, and Justin, if they think or spot something, you as employers, John and Mark. So is anybody spotting anything? But also, any of us could be doing something wrong. So if it's classed as you as the employers have made the breach, then it is you that would get reported. If we think John and Mark have done a breach, then we could report them. So we are looking, you know, this is an industry in itself again now, but we're working with it. The report, if somebody actually does find or think they have found that there is a breach, then you do, the report must be in writing and it needs to be soon, is what they sort of write down really, as reasonably practicable. You can make of that whatever you want, but how are we doing it? Well, in-house we've got breaches log, so we're doing that. All breaches are now recorded. Why I thought I'd raise this today is that you may have already had, or you may have in the future, a little email from us saying, unfortunately, you haven't done this. We will be recording it as a breach because you are outside of time limits or you haven't given us what we needed. But not everything will be reported to the pensions regulator. How will we decide? So they've actually laid down, there are some not rules, there's some guidance around what does the regulator want to know about. We've got to record it, but we're only going to report it to the regulator if we actually, if it hits into your red. So you're looking there, so what we're looking at is it, what is going to be the implications of it basically? Is it likely to be of material significance? If we had a major employer didn't give us a year-end data, it could be majorly important because all of those employees wouldn't be able to get their annual benefit statement. If we can't get our annual benefit statements out, then that is a reportable instance, so that is a breach. So we're looking at, we do rag rate them according to the red, amber, green. So your ambers, you'd be looking at, with an employer, if they'd had several amber reports, they may not in themselves have been classed as a material significance, but a few of them on our log may actually be sort of ringing some bells for us. And green, again, it's not likely to be material. But again, if we had one employer that had a dozen green instances on, we know we've got an issue with that employer that we probably need to go out and either educate or work with them to see what was the issue, why were they not being able to comply with whatever was going wrong. All of the framework about the breaches is on the pensions regulator sites as well, so we've got all of these links on our website too. So that's what materially significant is according to the regulator. So we're looking at what's happened, why did it happen, what are the wider implications, so it could be that instance of those annual benefit statements again. Here's some examples. Failed to enter someone in the scheme, so this is your payroll office, or your payroll provider if you actually subcontract your payroll out. It's not your payroll provider that will be failing, they may fail on your contract. you as the employer actually has the responsibility to ensure that if you are, depends on your type of employment or your employer with us in the fund, but if you're a statutory employer, all of your employees have to contractually, if they've got a contract for more than 3 months, be put into the pension scheme. So it's knowing that you're covering the rules. And these rules, academies now, becoming employers in their own right, they have to know what the rules are that they're actually complying with. An academy follows exactly the same rules as a local authority and a college. If it's an old FE college that's come from the sort of local authority arena, at the moment you're a type of body that all of those employees, they don't have a choice. They can opt out through, they have a choice to not be in, but you don't have a choice to not put them in the first place. You have to follow the rules. Late payment of your contributions, we need those by the 19th of each month. Supported by the statement that actually breaks down those contributions, and we've had a lot of employers that have actually been stating, asking us, why do we need to break this down? Why have we got to do this? Why have we got to give it you in the way that you want? It is dictated the time that you need that, and the regulations state that payment must be supported by a statement. So that's why we're trying to work with systems and putting things in place that hopefully will help you do that quicker as well. But not quicker, but easier as well. You've got to do it, so let's try and find some way that means we're getting good data from you on time. Other list of things, I mean, that's just a few examples. You can have a look at things there. No discretions policy. I won't name and shame, but we still do have some employers who are probably in the audience. Becky might have, you haven't put a red dot or anything on their name tag, but I can tell which ones they are. And some of you still haven't got a discretions policy in place. That's now 2 years out of date. So those people will have been written to for that, because we will have recorded you on our breaches log, but we haven't reported anybody. We're still working with you. This is one of the examples I just mentioned before, so year-end data. What we would do is work with you. The steps here are to show you what we're going to do. We're not just going to report you directly to the regulator. For us, it wouldn't be material the first time. What we would do is work with you. Have you got systems in place? Why did it happen? Are you going to give us that data? What's the timescale for giving us that data? But if you could answer yes to any of the above regarding materiality, it might mean that actually we do have to report it. But we would want to work with you first, because it comes down to communication. We have a breaches policy. So we've got lots of policies. We have to. Part of our record keeping, part of the legislation dictates we have to have a policy on certain things. So just like you have to have your discretions policy, so do we. We have a discretions policy. We've got one. James signs off on it. We do take it to pensions committee. We update that annually. We'll do a revision on it. But just like you, we have to go through the list and say, what does regulation say as an administering authority we have a discretion on? We have to put that in our policy. But we've got a breaches policy as well. You can find it there on the website. Lots of other ones as well. We keep talking about all of our policies, but it is worthwhile getting to know your employer's area on that website and telling us if it doesn't work for you. We've tried to ensure that it's in one area and all of the help that you need is there. Anyway, I mentioned earlier, we can have penalties awarded to us by pensions regulator. They do impose fines. They have imposed fines over the last 2 years, but at the moment they usually will work with employers or funds rather than imposing fines, but they can do. And if we were imposed a fine down to an employer who had actually breached, then we would pass on that fine, and that's in the pension administration strategy. Because the regulations say we can pass it on as long as it's in our pension administration strategy. So it is in there. But again, we would hope that this fund didn't get to the stage that it actually needed to report something to the regulator or get something found by the regulator that we got fined. You'll be pleased to know, it's me nearly over. Hopefully today has just given you a bit of an insight as to why we do need to contact you, why you need to keep in touch, why you need to ensure that your contractors or your payroll offices know what they're doing and that you can check yourself that your procedures and your processes are robust. Are you ticking off what you have to do under the legislation as an employer in our fund? We want to pay your members accurately, so we need to know who your members are. We need to know if your members leave. We need to know what their pay is accurately to pass on the information for John to ensure that your rate is set correctly. Down to the increases in pay. If your system is not giving us the right pay, that could be an indication of why did your pay go up so much. It might be that you actually gave us the wrong figure. Some of this does come down, it's your data, so the information we're using comes from yourselves. So make sure that your own systems are robust. We like to educate our members. The only way they're going to get to know what they're paying for is if they actually read the communications we send them. So promoting the benefits to your staff, if you've got, if you're a big employer, this is a big benefit for them. If you're a small employer and you offer it to all of your employees, especially the town and parish councils now, academies, it's a big pull for, and also do you use it in your recruitment? It's a big benefit to have, to be in a good, still defined benefit scheme. As well as their salary with you, they're getting this as well. They don't get this with many other employers. It's a big draw for you to try and entice staff to come for your jobs. Do circulate our communications, please. If something comes out, if a poster needs putting up or something, if you would print it off and do that for us, please. It's just one way of you getting that information to your staff. We're here to help. Please feedback if you want any other training needs or anything. And feedback sheets are on the chair as usual. We could do a bit of feedback. Was the meeting, did it hit the mark? Were you okay? And just to remind you, that's what we're here to do at the moment. Our focus is on these internal controls. We're looking at ensuring that the processes are in place between ourselves and you, that we can sign off to say our data is robust, our record keeping is good, and that we can communicate well to our employees. So thank you for coming and listening to me. My team, there's quite a few of us here today that will be around for any queries afterwards. So as well as taking the opportunity to see John and Mark or us, if there's any queries you want to ask on your schedule that you'll get at the end. If there's anybody else in the audience that's got any day-to-day business as usual pension questions or any issues you want to discuss, take the opportunity to have a chat with us or find members of the team you might talk to on the phone and get to know them face to face. So thank you. I will pass on to Mark. Oh, any questions? I'm not giving you the opportunity. Is there any questions? Sorry, Mark.
General question on communication. Obviously, since you've launched your portal now, have you noticed any increase in communication or queries coming back with employees being able to access the portal, or have you had people not using the portal and we need to do more about pushing that, because we have pushed it quite a lot with our
with your members?
Yeah, with the members.
We've got some data that's just going to committee. Becky, would you just want, we've
got 25% of our active members now online looking at their benefit statement and self-service. We're really pleased with 25% because looking at other funds who've introduced MSS for their first time this year for annual benefit statements, they've got lower numbers than us, they've got about 10 to 15. So, but it's only going to be more of a success if you help us, so get that message out there. If someone says, oh, I want a benefit quote, I'm picking up the phone and asking us, they can do their own account. So, and there's posters and things like that, as Becky said. So, 25% at the moment of our active members are using.
Are you able to let us know who hasn't gone through that?
We've certainly got that multi-list, yes.
So we can push it, we can sort of target it a little bit more. Because it saves me a lot of hassle.
Can everybody hear Becky?
Okay. What interestingly, I've asked our systems person for this week is a breakdown of who's not using it by employer, by age, by gender, and just so that actually helps me plan in the comms over the next few months. Because then we can target specific employers and say, oh, actually, a lot of your staff haven't signed up. Shall we come and visit you and do a morning session, get people engaged, and we can actually get them signed on. So if you want that information, if you want me to let you know how the percentage of your staff who are using our online system, I can certainly give that to you.
So watch this space. And so 25%, that's good really for the communication that we've done over the last 2 years, but we'll be increasing on that. Anybody else? No? I'm going to pass over to Mark.
Okay, thanks for that, Debbie. This will be the last session now before you all get your results, so do bear with us for a few more minutes. We're just going to use this last session to go through a few general issues that are currently going on in the LGPS, things you may or may not be aware of that might have an impact on you over the coming months, next year or so. Yeah, complicated technology. The first one I want to talk about briefly is LGPS exit payments. Now, some of you might be quite familiar with this if you've been unfortunate enough to have to make staff redundant, make layoffs. You'll be aware of the current LGPS terms and the possible changes that may be upcoming. For other of you who've been fortunate enough to avoid that so far, this might be not an area that you know too much about. What's basically happening is, at the moment, the government is reviewing the redundancy terms across the public sector generally, and the LGPS is part of that. The stated aim is to reform it, to make it fairer, more modern, and more flexible, which you can read as the other red bit, reduce costs. You can make an argument whether that's fair or not, but the current benefits are quite out of line with the private sector. I'm sure you'll have all have read at some point or other in the newspapers or in the news some horror story about someone leaving the public sector and getting a huge payoff and then shortly afterwards coming back. Anecdotally, my wife is a civil servant. She actually sits next to someone who's made redundant from the pension service who got a redundancy payout of 7 times the pay and then came back and worked for the government again a couple of years later, which is clearly, it's quite shocking. It's not something you would ever get in the private sector. So the government is trying to avoid these sorts of stories and trying to make things fairer and more equitable and make better use of public money, if you like. Now, people may have views on that one way or the other, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. I have my own views. To be honest, those views don't particularly matter. This is something that's happening, and we just have to deal with it, whether we like it or not. Probably worth just touching on for those who haven't encountered them, the current LGPS benefits, the current benefits in local government. Currently, when someone's made redundant, they can get a lump sum payment. It can be up to 2 years' worth of pay. Now, that's the current limit, and it can be less than that, and often is. Each employer will apply their own policy, and many will go far lower than that. But the limit, as it stands, is far higher than you would typically get in the private sector, which leads to these stories again, which is driving the need for change. The other thing, which isn't necessarily so obvious, which can be more costly, is the pension allowance that you get when you made redundant. Anyone who's over 55 and is made redundant in the LGPS can retire immediately without any reduction in benefits. So what this means, if for example you've got someone who's just turned 55, they've got a £10,000 pension built up which they can claim in 10 years. If you make them redundant, all of a sudden instead of claiming that in 10 years, they can get it immediately. So you have to pay £10,000 a year plus pension increases for 10 years. And the total cost of that, even after you allow for, if we talked about before, investment returns can get easily into 6 figures. So for that example, we can easily talk about £100,000. And this can be a significant cost, particularly if you're not expecting it. And even if you are, it can kind of limit the way you sort of deal with your staff and the way you're managing your employees and your payroll. And this is different to other LGPS benefits. Most of them are built up gradually over time, and sort of funded gradually over time. This is one that kind of occurs like that. One day the benefit isn't there, the next day it is. It's a one-off cost, it's a sudden increase. And so what the pension fund will do is they will turn around to you and say, give us that money immediately. You've increased this benefit by a huge amount by doing this. We would like the cash straight away. So at least a significant one-off costs, particularly for small employers in the context of your cash flows, it can be really quite something. So the government wants to manage this. If we look at what they're doing, some things have already been done. They've introduced a £95,000 cap on these payouts you receive at retirement. They've also introduced some limits, so if particularly high earners, if they leave the government, they get these benefits and then they come back into government employment, they have to fund some of this back. This is already done. It's on statute, but it's not quite brought into law yet, but it is imminent and agreed, so we know that is happening. Some additional things they're considering. They're going to cap the pay using these payouts, so typically they're based on payroll. So for people earning over 80,000, the talk is initially they're going to look at capping the pay used to calculate the lump sum at 80,000. Again, targeting the high earners, the horror stories that you hear about. Similar to that, they're also going to link the service. As I said before, currently you can get 2 years pay. They're going to cap that, or they're looking to cap that at 3 weeks per year worked, with a total cap of 15 months pay. So again, they're bringing that down. They're also looking to limit the early access to pension, which is where our interest lies from a pensions LGPS point of view. And there are a few ways they're thinking of doing that. The first is just to increase the age from 55, so instead of 55, you get unreduced benefits, it might go up to 58, 60, whatever is ultimately agreed. Any increase in that age will obviously reduce the one-off cost you have to pay to the fund. Second thing that's been mentioned or considered is to offset the cost against the lump sum the member receives. So in my example earlier, if the cost of enhancing those benefits is say 100,000 and the member would otherwise have got a £95,000 payout, basically they would get no payout, that money would be taken to fund the additional pension cost, and because the 95 grand doesn't quite cover it, they might get a little reduction in the pension as well. That's the second option. The third option, arguably the simplest, and if you don't agree with these sort of things, arguably the most appropriate, others will feel differently, is to scrap this benefit altogether. So there'll be no enhancement of pension benefits wouldn't change. Either you'd wait till you're 65, or you would take your pension, but it would be reduced so that there was no increase in the overall liability value. So there was no sort of cost to the employer. So these are the things that are being considered. In terms of where we are and what's going to happen, the government has responded to the proposal, the consultation they put out, and they've batted it back to the individual government departments. So for the LGPS, it's with the DCLG. They're currently finalising the proposals. They have to take them back to the government by mid-December. After that, the government will either agree to these proposals or demand changes. And all this is with a view for this being brought into effect from next summer, so sort of June next year. So by that point, these reforms will be in effect. The cost of making people redundant, of dealing with exits within the LGPS will come down. So for those of you who either need to do this or won't work, it's just something to bear in mind as and when you're planning your sort of long-term payroll management, your employee management. The next issue I want to talk about, you're probably not aware of this, but the UK is actually leaving the European Union. It's something we're calling Brexit, for short. Obviously, this is a huge thing. It's going to have a massive impact on all aspects of our lives, and the LGPS won't be any different. Unfortunately, we don't know particularly what that's going to be like yet, or what the impact will be in the long term. The easiest thing to do for now is to look at what's happened in the short term, and arguably it's been good so far. Stock markets are up. In the UK, they're up around 10%. Across the world, 25%. So assets are up, and this is a good thing for the fund, obviously. There's different factors driving that. At the global level, Brexit's probably only a relatively small part of this. There are other factors related to stabilising the oil markets, the Chinese economy, and so forth. So this is only one factor amongst that. I'm not sure how concerned or impacted the rest of the world is by what we do with the EU. Probably, as of yesterday morning, they might have bigger problems than that. The UK stock market is also up, but not by quite as much. The factors behind this are probably a little different. It's driven largely by the fall in sterling, which you can see in the top right. As you know, the pound has come down quite significantly since Brexit, down to historically low levels or thereabouts. What this has meant, a lot of UK companies in the market, they have overseas earnings. Those overseas earnings are now more valuable. It's pushed up the value of the companies. Similarly, anyone who exports to other countries can now do so more cheaply and competitively, again, pushing up their values. So on the face of it, those are all positive things, but there's another impact of sterling, which is that it has and is expected to push inflation up. Obviously, we import things from overseas, pound is weaker, those things are now more expensive, inflation rises. How this is a problem for the LGPS specifically, as we've already touched on a few times, all the benefits in the fund are index linked. They're all linked to CPI inflation. So when inflation goes up, what happens is those costs go up, obviously. What you can see here on the left is a chart of market implied RPI inflation. I'll explain this briefly. When we look at inflation, when we try and calculate it, we look at the yields available on government bonds, some of them are index linked. From that, you can derive a figure of what the market expects inflation to be over the shorter and longer term. Basically, what you're seeing is the blue line in the middle is sort of the position immediately before Brexit. The line at the very top is the position now. So what we're seeing is roughly a 0.5% increase in expected inflation over the longer term, which is matching what you see in the short-term inflation figures you might hear in the news, where they're starting to push up a little bit. So what this will mean ultimately is, in isolation, benefits will become more expensive. If we link back to the things we talked about earlier, what it means is, in terms of discount rate, you have to now achieve a higher overall return to maintain the same sort of level of contributions. So it's an additional pressure there. So that's the inflation issue, and things we know so far. The list of things we don't know, unfortunately, is much bigger at this point. Domestic politics, we all know it's going through the courts. We don't know what our negotiating stance is going to be, who's going to be negotiating, to what degree Parliament will have a say, whether we go for a softer or stronger position. There's a similar unknown on the European side. We hope that they'll be pragmatic and try and straighten trade deals and so forth that are good for everyone. But there may be a tendency or a want to kind of punish us for leaving if they're sad to see us go. So we don't really know how that's going to work out yet. And then at the bottom we have the market and economic impact. I've talked about the market a little bit. Probably the biggest factor influencing everything, and the one that's most unknown, is the general impact on the long-term economy. If the UK kind of prospers and does well outside the EU, that will benefit us all generally. It'll benefit tax revenues, it'll benefit local employers, and it'll benefit the fund. Assets will go up, the employers will be that much more secure, benefits will be slightly easier to meet. If things go the other way, and we don't do so well out of leaving the EU, the effect will go the other way, and it could be a negative. Ultimately, as you probably gathered, we don't know a great deal about how this is going to work out in the long term. So for the minute, it's very much kind of a watching brief. The fund has just got to stand ready to react as more details become available. So while we don't know how it'll impact us, it'll almost certainly have an impact going forward. Now John's going to take you through a few other issues that are going to affect you.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Okay, a little bit on new fair deal. I mean, just a little bit of background on what this is all about for those who are not familiar with this one. I mean, in general, the government has a policy of where employees are outsourced from the public sector. Then for those employees that are outsourced, there ought to be general continuity of existing pension arrangements. And there are two ways. There are two legislative ways or guidance ways that this has been put into force. One's the Best Value Directive, which applies to local authorities, which is legally binding, and the other angle, which doesn't apply to local authorities, but does apply to some other local authority employers, such as academies and schools, is the fair deal guidance. And in practice, both of them have got fairly similar effects. They both require essentially continuity of pension provision at roughly current levels for employees who are outsourced. But at the moment there are two ways that you can do that. One is you can come in, the new employer can come into the LGPS as an admitted body. The other one is that the contractor, the new employer, can set up their own, what we call broadly comparable scheme, as a privately run scheme to provide the benefits instead of the LGPS. And in practice, admission to the LGPS is by far the simpler approach, and so it's by far the most common one that's used for this purpose at the moment. Now, the government is in the process of overhauling this, and for most of the public service arrangements, it's already done so. And it implemented a new fair deal with effect from October 2013. And essentially what new fair deal is saying is that for any new outsourcing and any new contracts that go ahead in the future, setting up your own broadly comparable scheme is not an option, and employees should in general be retained within within their existing pension scheme. The DCLG, as the government department for the LGPS, are currently considering what that means. They're currently consulting on what the implementation of the new fair deal means for the LGPS. So in due course, this will replace the best value approach, although, as I said before, the two are pretty similar in their effects anyway. In general, what's going to happen is like the other public service schemes, the option of a contractor, the new employer, establishing their own privately run pension scheme will disappear, and the new employer will be required to become an admitted body within the LGPS. And the way that that will be achieved in practice is that employees transferring across will be deemed to be protected and therefore have a right to remain in the LGPS. Now, there might be some flexibility on that if there's already an existing contract which has already got a broadly comparable scheme, the private scheme, which is being run by the new employer, and it might be possible to maintain that or a variant where that's already in place. But in general, that won't be an option. One thing that is coming through as one of the changes is in the draft regulations, the provision for the exit payments to become payable by the contractor to the LGPS could in practice work both ways in the future, so that if there's a funding surplus at the end of the contract, then the LGPS might be required to refund that back to the contractor. So what this all means in practice is you have this new facility for a protected transferee employee who's undergoing a compulsory transfer out of the LGPS, and the new employer is not offering that employee some other public sector pension provision, and the member remains protected as long as they work on that particular contract, regardless of who the employer is. So this is going to apply to most employers, and the way this peculiarity of the regs at the moment, in that seems to include admission bodies as well as the employers that you would expect it to apply to. But it doesn't. But as things are drafted at the moment, it doesn't seem to apply to further and higher education employers and police and crime commissioners. So there's a few things that could change, I think, in the consultation process. There's a few things that are up for grabs. But I think the main things to bear in mind are, the key changes are there's potentially a difference between the old requirements and the new ones in terms of the employers that are going to be covered by it. Unless there's already a broadly comparable scheme in existence, that's not generally going to be allowable. And on outsourcing people from the LGPS, you probably have to ensure that provision was made for them to remain in the LGPS. And then at the end of the contract, there's a provision for if there's a funding surplus within the fund in relation to that contract, for that refund to be paid back by the contractor. But the details, the consultation on this is closed, and the government at the moment is still considering the responses. How quickly that will be, I don't know, because the DCLG isn't particularly well resourced on the pension side at the moment. A lot of its existing resources are taken up with the pooling of assets, and given that the government announced its main policy 3 years ago, and it's only fairly recently that the LGPS has come out with its preferred option, you can probably gauge from that how far up the priority tree sorting out new fair deal actually is for the DCLG. Okay, a little bit about cost management in the LGPS and what's going on here. Okay, the general principle behind cost management is that when the new scheme was set up, the cost of the scheme was calculated, and there was an agreement or a requirement under the Public Service Pensions Act that future costs, by which we mean the costs of future service benefits, in all the public sector schemes would remain within certain tolerances. And the general tolerance set by HM Treasury was plus or minus 2% of pensionable pay. So if the future service costs of the scheme go up by more than 2% of pay, then there is a mechanism either for reducing benefits or increasing employee contributions so that the costs come back to the original target level. In practice for the LGPS, the cost management process covers the LGPS as a whole, so it's covering the LGPS in aggregate, not individual funds experience. It's only going to kick in from 1st of April 2019. That's the earliest date at which any changes can be made. But the effect of the effect of the changes is fairly limited. The process itself splits the cost management, splits any cost changes into what are deemed employer costs and member costs. And member costs will cover things like pay growth, longevity, changes in state pension age, and take up the 50-50 scheme. So if any of those factors cause an increase in scheme costs, then there's a mechanism to bring those costs back into line with the original targets. On the other side of the coin, though, we've got the investment returns, changes in discount rates, liabilities for historic leavers. They all form part of the employer costs. And those are things which, as far as the LGPS are concerned, do tend to be the major drivers of funding positions and costs for the LGPS. But those particular factors are all outside this main cost management process. Now, at the moment, there are a few things that we know about that might cause the cost of the scheme to increase within the cost management process, and therefore which might cause the benefits to be dragged back a little bit, or the contributions for employees to be increased. So these are taken with the 50-50 scheme, which has been pitifully low, as we've referred to earlier in the session. There's some extra revaluation of benefits, which is just a technical feature in that the government made the scheme a little bit more generous after the initial terms of the scheme had been agreed between the LG employers and the unions. And then there's membership of the public sector transfer club, which also wasn't factored into the cost of the initial agreements. Now, those taken together are probably going to mean an increase in the cost of this cost management process of between 1 and 1.5% of pay. And that might well cause the Scheme Advisory Board to take action, to recommend that action is brought in to bring back the cost to the target level. So we could see some reduction in costs coming through at the moment. There's still a long way to go. In practice, as I said, any changes in benefits or contributions to bring those cost levels back to the target level are not going to take effect until the 1st of April 2019 at the earliest. Okay, finally, I was going to cover national security. Do you want me to do this, or do you want to get? We're sort of out of time. I'll carry on, and I'll cover this one fairly quickly. Just we mentioned earlier that the LGPS is coming under more scrutiny from from a number of bodies, TPR, Scheme Advisory Board, Government Actuaries Department, all sticking the finger in the pie, if you like, and wanting to ensure that the LGPS not so much ensure that it's well run, because I think in general it is at the moment, but that people can demonstrate that it is being well run. And one of the things that came on board was supervision of the funding positions and cost management and governance of the LGPS. Initially, this came through the LGPS's National Scheme Advisory Board, who set out 18 key performance indicators by which funds could measure themselves. And 3 of those that listed up there, 3 of these KPIs, key performance indicators related to funding. What's your funding level and contributions look like? Is it have you got a reasonable plan there? Is your funding level rising, expected to rise? What's your cash flow position like? Is your deficit recovery plan consistent and credible? And how difficult is it going to be for a particular fund to get back to full funding? So the National Scheme Advisory Board set all these KPIs up on more of on as much of a self-assessment basis as anything, as a way by which funds could measure themselves and then report back against how they were doing against these targets. And then things moved on a little bit, and the funding, the GAD under the Government Actuaries Department, GAD under the terms of the Public Service Pensions Act, are required to do a Section 13 review, a review into that particular provision of the Public Service Pensions Act, of looking at the actuarial valuations, the outcomes, comparing one LGPS scheme against another, and setting out whether individual schemes' valuation results are reasonable, consistent with other LGPS funds, and whether their deficit recovery plans are credible. Now, the first official one hasn't kicked in yet, but what's actually happened in practice is that all those funding KPIs have been swept into GAD's Section 13 review, and the GAD has really assumed responsibility for all of those. It carried out a dry run of its Section 13 review process at 2013. And I'm pleased to say, the Shropshire Fund, it gave all the funds red, amber, green ratings in all of the areas that it was measuring. And I'm pleased to say the Shropshire Fund came out with a clean bill of health, so achieved green ratings in all the things that were being measured. But the process is going to be repeated for real on the back of the 2016 actuarial valuations. And at this stage, we don't know what is going to come out, but we've no reason to have any concerns for the Shropshire Fund. Do we like the GAD Section 13 process? I think as fund advisors, I guess we appreciate that some form of external scrutiny is inevitable following the Public Service Pensions Act. But we're not of ourselves convinced that it's going to assist decision making. We don't think it really tells you whether the scheme is well run or that it supports the risk management policies which LGPS funds are following. And we do have some concerns that some of the targets which GAD have set might be seen as minimum targets and might just engineer a race to the bottom in terms of funding the LGPS going forward. So we appreciate the scrutiny is necessary. We think it could be more focused, more appropriately focused than it is at the moment. Okay, and that's it from me. Debbie, do you want to?
No, I was going to check. Anybody got any further questions? Queries? As I said, the stats here. On your badges, if you're responsible for picking up your employer rate schedule, you'll have a table number on it. It's got 4 tables at the back, and it's just to try and separate out that we haven't got you all queuing for one table. If you would get your schedule and sign for it, if then anybody's got any questions, please either take the opportunity to come and ask me, or actually the actuaries whilst they're here. But any other queries, please let me know. And the only other thing I wanted to thank you for is coming. But also, we've been getting a few questions recently about the regional pooling. It was touched on today and James just mentioned it. That is the investment. At the moment, they're not regionalising my team. We keep getting asked, well, are you still going to be here next year? Because aren't they calling all of the funds? And we went, no, it's the investment they're looking at calling, and that's just the money that's being invested. Everything else is staying the same. Our pensions committee will still have responsibility for deciding what assets they want to invest in. And my team at the moment in Shropshire will still be responsible for administering the fund. They looked at should they do something with administration and pool them, but they didn't seem to be making any savings, so that's when they started looking at investments. So just because we keep getting the question asked quite often recently, well, will you still be here in 2 years' time? At the moment, yes. Lots of things can happen, it might change my mind next week, but we are still here, and so we will be the ones that are dealing with you. So thank you ever so much for coming, and hopefully you won't have too much bad news when you pick up the schedule.